Hey, Grace.
Yes.
When it's not important, but when you have a chance, we're all looking at, you have this very nice background behind you and it's backwards.
Oh, is it? Okay. Thank you for letting me know. That's very important.
So if you're going to invest.
That's funny. Reverse camera.
Oh, it doesn't look reversed on mine.
Now it's good.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, it is good. Just out of curiosity, Jabaran? Not sure who that is.
That is Gibran, one of our public engagement staffers.
Okay, just checking. I didn't know if it was an eye test on my part, and I had to read the letters like I do with the eye does.
Yeah, you got him right.
Find the right spot on my progressives. Michael, Monsignor, good morning to all. Good morning, Judge. I think I saw Kevin's name.
Dennis.
And good morning to all. We're just waiting for our quorum to be hit and we'll officially start. Hi, Judge. Good seeing you. You're muted if you were just talking, Judge.
I wish I were home in Hawaii, frolicking in the waves, but here I am in an office with a messy office, and that's why I have this nicer background.
I understand. I know where I would be as well. So I hear you loud and clear. So just as a sidebar conversation before we officially start, anytime I see Michael, I always have to report my running update. So I'm running this Saturday, Michael, just as an FYI.
You have a race or you're just running?
No, it's the Harlem 5K, Percy Sutton 5K.
Oh, great. All right.
Yep.
Have a good run. Hopefully the weather will hold out.
It's supposed to be gorgeous. But you know, so interesting. I thought about that this morning. Even if it's raining, it doesn't bother me. I'll be out there running. And I even for this 5K, I train because they have that hill. And so the hill is always my mental challenge to conquer. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Have you
All
been
right.
And
training in
then the next race after that will be Staten Island for me.
Best of all of them. Yeah.
Staten Island half. That's my baseline. Someone started to say something, so I'll stop.
Have you been training in the heat, Dennis?
I have at 4:30 in the morning. I'm out in the streets running and clocking my miles in. Hey, doctor, how are you, sir?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you. Joseph, Grace, where are we at now?
We do have quorum.
Okay, so with everyone's permission, we will officially start. And I just wanted, before we ask for the roll call, to report that pursuant to the governor's emergency executive order on COVID-19 protocols, we are convening this all virtual public meeting. So it's a pleasure to welcome all of you, both commissioners, to our fantastic staff, and to the public who is watching as well. My name is Dennis Walcott, and I have the honor to be the chair, but more importantly, just one of 15 members of the commission. And with that being said, I'd like to call on our Deputy Executive Director, Joseph Maligno, to give the roll call, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to conduct a roll call now. Dennis Walcott,
Present.
Yvonne Samuel Collado,
Present.
Honorable Marilyn Go,
Present.
Kevin Hanratty,
Present.
Maria Mateo, Joshua Schneps, Lisa Soren, Monsignor Kevin Sullivan,
Present.
Kai Ki Wong, Maf Misban Uden, Michael Schnall.
Present.
Present.
Bob is present.
And
I'm present too.
okay, so that was present for Michael Schnall and Maf Uden.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Kristen Johnson,
Present.
Gregory Kirschenbaum, Mark Warzel,
Present.
Darren Porcher,
Present.
and that is the end of roll call.
Thank you, sir. And all of you have received minutes beforehand. If there are any recommendations for corrections, we'll entertain that. If not, can we have a motion to so move? Is there a second?
Second the motion.
Thank you, doctor. There's a second. All of those in favor, please say aye or press.
Aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposition? If not, it has passed that we accept the minutes. So thank you very much. And welcome to this very unique meeting.
Sorry, my apologies. This is the court reporter. Just, I did not catch who made the motions. I didn't.
Oh, thank you for clarifying, court reporter.
That was Marv Uden.
And it was Darren Porcher that seconded the motion.
Thank you very much. And thank you. And anytime I go too fast or we go too fast, please let us know, because also we're having, as usual, our meeting transcribed. So again, thank you for asking the question. And so with this, I would like to turn it over to our great executive director, Dr. John Flateau, because this is a very unique meeting and we're excited to have people watching us on YouTube as well, in addition to the commissioners. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have opportunity for the commissioners to have Q&A. And while the presentation is taking place and also Dr. Flateau is talking, if we can mute our mics so that way we don't have any background noise. And with that being said, Dr. Flateau, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Walcott and Districting Commission. The Districting Commission, at its July 15th meeting, approved the public release of the preliminary plan. The Commission utilized several inputs, including legal guidance framed by the federal voting rights laws, state laws, city charter, census data, other research, 5 public hearings, and other inputs to assist the Commission in producing the preliminary plan. A very important research tool which also assists the Commission's important City Council redistricting work, is known as Racial Block Voting Analysis, or RBV. This racial block voting methodology uses statistical regression analyses and diagnostics on the preliminary plan maps and districts, as well as on subsequent draft maps, to ensure that proposed New York City Council districts are constructed to be in compliance with voting rights and other important requirements. Our districting commission is fortunate to again retain a national expert on RBV analysis, a renowned social scientist, Dr. Lisa Hanley, PhD, who also served as the 2013 New Districting Commissioner's expert, providing this similar research and guidance for New York City's very same current city council districts. She, ably assisted by Sid Parker, our own senior data manager. Dr. Hanley is statistically analyzing 5 years of voting patterns of more than 150 municipal and state elections for this ongoing RBV analysis. Jeff Weiss is the Commission's special counsel for redistricting, a national expert who advised the 2013 Commission as well. He is now advising our Commission on federal, state, and local redistricting and voting rights laws, along with the New York City Law Department and our General Counsel, Grace Pune. I have academic training in this field as well and have served on a number of redistricting commissions. I'm honored to serve as your executive director with our great commission staff on this important work. At this time, I am pleased to present Dr. Lisa Hanley, PhD, who will now conduct for our commission and for the public an information seminar on racial block voting analysis and its application to the New York City Council redistricting process. Dr. Hanley.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. I would like to share my screen because I have lots of statistics to show you, but I'm only teasing. You have a very challenging task in front of you, and I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about one bit of it. And that is, can you see my screen? Yes, okay. What I want to talk about is how to determine if any redistricting plan that you draw, any proposed plan, complies with the Voting Rights Act or not. Now you have a whole lot of redistricting criteria that you have to balance. And this slide shows some of these. But this is not an equal balancing act. Some of these are more important than others. Some are going to get you in federal court if you don't comply. So the triangle behind this list is meant to show that some things like the US Constitution and the Federal Voting Rights Act trump some things below that, like the New York City Charter. And in fact, near the top of that triangle is the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, you also have to pay attention to all of these other criteria, but the only one that's going to actually trump it is going to be equal population So for example, you couldn't draw districts that did not comply with equal population in order to create minority districts or districts that would elect minority preferred candidates. But you can't say, we're going to, for example, keep this community of interest intact if doing so would violate the Voting Rights Act. So here are the criteria that you have to pay attention to. And again, a particularly important one is complying with the Federal Voting Rights Act, that you cannot dilute minority votes. And now this is also incorporated into New York state law with the recently passed John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 used to have more sections than it does now. Section 2 is the section that we're going to pay attention to today. It prohibits any voting standard, practice, or procedure, including a redistricting plan, that results in the denial or dilution of minority voting strength. The section that the Supreme Court held as unconstitutional not very long ago was Section 5. When I was involved with New York redistricting 10 years ago, not only did you have to make sure that the plan complied with Section 2, or you would be sued, you had to submit the plan to the Department of Justice, because 3 New York City boroughs were actually covered by Section 5, and the Justice Department would have to pre-approve them before you could put them into place. So 10 years ago, we drew plans. You chose a plan, we submitted it, and we had to wait for the Justice Department to give the okay before you could actually enact it. This time, you don't have that process to go through. But of course, if you don't comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, you will, or at least you can be sued, and you can lose. Now, one important thing about Section 2 is that it looks at the effect of the plan and not the intent behind the drawers of the plan. So you can put into place a plan that you don't intend will discriminate, but if it has the effect of discriminating against voters, it will be declared illegal. Same is true of voters. You may have voters that vote differently, but it doesn't mean that they're prejudiced and they're not willing to vote for other people. You don't have to show that for people of other racial or ethnic groups. You just have to show that by voting for the candidates that they do support, this means that the candidates that are preferred by minority voters are defeated. So a redistricting plan that violates the Voting Rights Act is one that either cracks or packs or submerges a geographically concentrated minority community across districts. Now, in the upper right-hand corner is an example of a district that cracks a minority community. You can see the pink, the salmon colored, is a geographically concentrated minority community. And what's happened is the lines have been drawn in such a way that the community is spread across 5 districts so that they never make up more than 35% of a district and therefore cannot elect a candidate of choice in any of these districts. The example below that is an example of a plan that packs a community into a single district. Now, in this particular example, it created a district that's 100% pink, and so this district will be able to elect the pink candidate of choice, but they will have no impact on any of the other districts. Now, this minority community is probably large enough to be able to elect their candidates of choice in 2 communities, but it was not drawn that way. They were packed into a single community so that they could only elect one candidate of choice. Now, these examples are examples that we have seen over and over again. We end up in court a lot of times with exactly this kind of situation. Okay. In 1982, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was amended, and it was amended to make it clear that the intent of the line drawers didn't matter. What only mattered was the effect of the plan and whether it diluted minority votes, whether it was intentional or not. In 1986, a Supreme Court case called Thornburg v. Jingles actually told us how to determine if a plan diluted minority votes in a way that violated Section 2. And the Supreme Court put out what's called the three-pronged test. First, the minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact to form a majority in a single-member district. Second, the minority group must be politically cohesive. Third, whites must vote as a bloc to usually defeat minority preferred candidates. So in terms of the first prong, what that has meant over time in court cases that followed Thornburg, we now know that by sufficiently large, we mean the group must be able to make up, if you're talking about Black voters, 50% of the Black voting age population. You could create another district, or a district, or another district that had at least 50% Black voting age population. With Hispanics, we think it's citizen voting age population. The Fifth Circuit has not decreed that, but for example, the Ninth Circuit and the Fifth Circuit have both said it's not voting age population, it's citizen voting age population for Hispanics. Geographically compact, well, you don't have to draw a district that strings across the state, but we don't really have a definition of geographically compact other than the old interocular taste. Let's look at it and make sure that it doesn't look funny. By the minority group being politically cohesive, we mean that the minority group, if given a district, would actually support the same candidate. It wouldn't make sense to create a district in which the minority group wasn't cohesive and wouldn't support a single candidate. So it means that they are voting for the same candidates. And finally, in terms of whites block voting, what we mean is they don't have to block vote for a single another candidate. They just have to not support the minority preferred candidate in such a way that the minority preferred candidate is always losing. So how do we know these things? Especially since the ballot is secret. What we do is a racial block voting analysis. A racial block voting analysis is a way to estimate the voting patterns of white voters and minority voters to determine if the minority voters are politically cohesive and to determine if whites are block voting against these. So this is what I did here in New York. This is what I did 10 years ago. This is what I do in hundreds of jurisdictions across the country. I do a racial block voting analysis to estimate how white voters and minority voters are voting. What's required is two pieces of information. Again, we don't know from the ballot the race of the voter. So we need to do some analyses, and we do it at an aggregate level. We look at election precincts, or what are called election districts here in New York, and we're going to look at patterns across election districts. We need to know the racial composition of these election districts, and we need to know the voting patterns of these election districts. And we're going to look for patterns across these election districts or precincts. Okay. The easiest way to do this would be something called homogeneous precinct analysis. And this is, we would look at precincts that we know, for example, all of the voters are Black voters, or all of the voters are Hispanic voters, or all of the voters are white voters, or all of the voters are Asian voters. And we would compare who they're supporting in any particular election and see if there's differences. And I always do this kind of analysis, but first of all, most precincts aren't homogeneous. And second of all, voters who live in these overwhelmingly one race precincts might well vote differently than voters who live in more integrated precincts. So here are the two statistical techniques that are used. Now, these have been used since the 1980s and 1990s. One, ecological regression analysis was developed actually in the 1970s, and it was used by the expert in Thornburg v. Jingles in 1982. So it's been around for a long time. And ecological inference was developed in the 1990s and has gone through various iterations. And both of these are well accepted by the court. Any voting rights case will include this kind of statistical analysis. Ecological simply means that we're not looking at like individual surveys, we're looking at an area, in this case, precinct. Okay, so these are the two kinds of analysis that I did, and I'm going to explain them. The first one, the one that's been around the longest, is ecological regression. Now, this is a county in Georgia, and this is the election in 2021, the runoff that included Raphael Warnock. Now, in Georgia, we actually know turnout by race. Here in New York City, we do not. So here in New York City, that horizontal axis would not be proportion Black turnout, it would be proportion Black of the voting age population. But Georgia, we can get a lot closer to the data because they actually collect registration data. When you go register to vote, you indicate your race, and then we can go back and look at the voter lists to see the proportion of Black voters that turned out in any given election. Each of these points on this diagram are election precincts. So, for example, this point would be an election precinct in which about 25% of the turnout was, or about 30% of the turnout was Black voters, and about 40% of the vote went for Warnock. And so you can see a clear pattern here, I presume. You can see that as the proportion of Black turnout increases, the proportion of votes for Warnock increases dramatically. And we're going to use that pattern to estimate how many whites voted for Warnock and how many Black voters voted for Warnock. Okay, so this was the standard up until Gary King, a professor at Harvard, developed a new methodology called ecological inference. And the main reason that he did that was there's a problem with ecological regression in that if voting is very polarized, as it is in this particular example, you can get estimates of, say, -5% of whites voting for Warnock and 105% of Blacks voting for Warnock. So this obviously didn't happen, and we would tend to round them down and say 100% and 0%, but Gary King came up with a new method that avoided that problem altogether, and that's called ecological inference, and this is a lot more complicated. This is called a tomographic plot. Here, instead of every point being a precinct, these lines are precincts, and it's showing you every possible conceivable relationship given the number of Black voters and the votes for Warnock that could have occurred and produced that particular result in that particular precinct. So all of these lines are precincts or election districts, as you call them here. And then we do a fancy thing called maximum likelihood statistics to come up with the strongest grouping of where the estimates are likely to be. And you can see along this line, this is where the heaviest concentration of this tomographic plot occurs. And we can estimate that Warnock got between 80 and 100% of the Black votes using this process. So when I do this analysis, typically what I do is I report the results of both methodologies because they both approach the question slightly differently. And I also actually use homogeneous precinct analysis as well, because these are three different methods. And presumably they're going to come up with estimates very close together. Now, if they don't come up with estimates very close together, we think that we don't really know who voted, and who voted for who, and we say it's inconclusive. But when you come up with estimates like this, you can see that the estimate for this county is using ecological regression, 94.9%, using ecological inference, 94.4% of Black voters supporting Warnock. While in terms of white voters, you can see that 23.5% and 25.5%. So our estimate doesn't matter exactly the percentage. We can just clearly see from this that Black voters are strongly supportive of Warnock and white voters are strongly in support of his white opponent. I forgot Loeffler's first name, but his white opponent. So this contest is racially polarized. In this instance, Black voters and white voters supported different candidates. Now, this happens to be a county in which Warnock won. And in fact, you'll remember Warnock won the state. So we also have to pay attention to not only the voting patterns, but is the Black preferred candidate winning or losing? So this is what I've been doing for the last few months here in New York City, looking at hundreds of contests to determine. Here in Georgia, there are two racial groups that you're interested in. You're interested in whites and Blacks. It's more complicated in New York because we have there are 6 protected groups and 5 protected groups under the Voting Rights Act, and 3 of them are here. You have Hispanics, you have Black voters, and you have Asian voters. And we have to pay attention to what all of those voters are doing. And so this is a very complex statistical problem to figure out not only how each group is voting in each of these elections. Okay. Back in 2013 or 2012, when I did this analysis, I determined that voting was polarized, that Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, and white voters typically voted for different candidates. This wasn't necessarily true in the general election, although it is true in, for example, Staten Island and Queens and some areas of Brooklyn, but it's almost always true in the Democratic primary that each of these groups prefer different voters, different candidates. And what that means is, if you have polarized voting, then you have to make sure that you create districts that give minority voters an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And if they already exist, and you have quite a number of them here in New York City, they should be maintained so that they continue to allow minority voters to elect their candidates of choice. Now, I look at each group individually, but in some areas, and in particular in general elections, you will find, for example, that Blacks and Hispanics might vote similarly. But each group is considered separately. And then at the end of the process, you might consider whether you're going to draw what's called a coalition district or not. But typically, you have to show that, if, let's say your coalition district is going to be a Black and Hispanic district, you have to show, for it to be required by the Voting Rights Act, you have to show that Black voters and Hispanic voters typically support the same candidates. Okay. So in 2013, as I said, voting was polarized, and you did have to create or maintain minority districts. This was done. The plan was submitted to the Department of Justice, and it was pre-cleared, and you did not get sued. And you want to do the same thing this time around, I assume. So how do we tell if a district is going to provide minority voters with an opportunity to elect? The first thing you can't do is say, okay, I'm just going to create all these 50% Black voting age population districts, because sometimes you don't, well, first of all, it violates the Constitution. In a case in 2015, that was called racial gerrymandering. You have to look at each district individually, and you have to do a district specific functional analysis and actually look at voting patterns in that district to determine if the candidate's choice of minority voters would be elected. So you're not going to work with an arbitrary demographic target like 50% Black voting age population. And this is a good thing, because it turns out, for example, in the state of Ohio, turns out that if you're in Northern Ohio, if you're up near Cleveland, you don't need a 50% district. You could have a 45% district, because you have enough white voters who are willing to vote for Black candidates. That candidate will get elected. But if you're in Southern Ohio, down near Cincinnati, it turns out that you need a 50%. And sometimes, like in a case I worked in Arkansas, 50% is not enough. If Black turnout is depressed and virtually no whites will vote for a Black candidate, sometimes you need 55%. So we want to take into account things like turnout, the relative rates of turnout, and we want to look at how much white crossover voting we might expect, or how much voting of any of the groups we might expect for the candidates of choice. So what I've done through this ratio of Black voting analysis is I have identified what are called Bellwether elections. And these Bellwether elections will help us to determine if the proposed districts will actually elect minority preferred candidate. A Bellwether election is a racially polarized election in which white voters preferred a different candidate than if we were looking at creating Black, the AP districts, and Black voters supported. And we're going to take this previous election and we're going to see what would happen in that previous election, in that previous polarized election, under the new proposed district boundaries. We want to see if the candidate preferred by Black voters or Hispanic voters actually carries that district. And we want to see that across a series of elections. And if the Black voters are successful in electing their Black preferred candidate over time and over these series of elections, we can assume that we have a district that will provide Black voters with an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Black voting age population district of 50%. It might be less, it might be more. Now, if you want to bring a section to suit, if a plaintiff group wants to sue, they have to show that they could draw an additional, I'm going to use Black voters as the example here, but a district that has at least a Black voting age population of 50%. But you don't have to draw districts that are 50%. You just have to draw districts that are opportunity districts. So with Black voters, sometimes, in fact, quite often, it doesn't have to be 50%. On the other hand, with Hispanic voters, it turns out it quite often needs to be more than 50%. So that's what we're going to be doing here. That's what we've been doing. What I've been doing is doing a racial Black voting analysis, determining if voting is polarized, and then taking these Bellwether elections and looking at whether the candidates of choice of each of these groups are winning the proposed districts. That is all I have, and I would love to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Doctor. Much appreciated. And with that being said, if we can open it up to our commissioners for questions, and also, Doctor, if you can, there you go, so we can see you. Commissioners, the floor is yours. Judge?
Now, what was your role in helping review the maps that were created? and released in July?
What I did was, at this point, the racial block voting analysis hadn't been completed, but using the information that I had, I used some Bellwether elections to determine if we had effective minority districts or not.
Judge, you want to follow up?
Now that you've completed your analysis, would your review be different at this point?
It would be more detailed.
And is there a report that you made?
I will be writing a report, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the process will be, Judge and commissioners and the audience, that we will be receiving a report. And so we'll let folks know when the report is complete, but that will be the next step in the process as well. Other commissioners?
Hi there. I wonder if you could answer this question now. How many years back did you look when looking at Bellwether elections?
To 2017. So we have 2017 and 2021 when we're talking about citywide and borough-wide contests. I also looked at a couple of contests that occurred in 2019 and 2022, but the furthest back I went was 2017.
Commissioner Johnson, a follow-up?
Not right now, thank you.
All right, and also just for the individual who's transcribing, both with any commissioner, if you can just identify yourself so that way she can record it officially. So prior to that was Judge Go, and this is Commissioner Johnson. So other commissioners?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have raised my hand.
Jump on in, sir.
Okay. Good morning. This is Mahfoudin, Dr. Lisa Henley. Thank you very much. It's a very good presentation. And I think we have learned more than what we knew until we have the district announced, draft district announced before. So now in your explanation on tomographic plot, based on the Georgia election, Warnock, re-election, I understand that. I don't know how important for us to know where Black people votes majority or not for their own candidate. The important part that I think you mentioned, whether I understood it right, is this. You said that if the Black voting district are voting for Black candidate, we must try to maintain that district. In our situation that we have experienced, that in order to accommodate additional census-related population within that district, it will be difficult to maintain such. Is it that we must, or it is also allowable that in some places you may have to increase non-Black population in this case, or bring down within that district Black population to accommodate other districts' numbers? Those things are allowable, or those things are not allowable as far as your explanation was concerned?
You are not required to draw a district if it's impossible to draw the district. If the district would have to be extremely strange in shape, for example, or if you were losing population. For example, in Alaska, where they're they're not losing Alaska Native population in general, but it's moving into Anchorage and it's hard to draw districts. If you can't draw a district, you can't maintain the same number of districts, then of course you don't have to, you can't. The law does not require you to draw strange non-contiguous districts in order to do that. If population is shifting in such a way that you're losing population and you cannot maintain a, say, an Asian district in South Manhattan because you're gaining white population and losing Asian population, then you just can't do it. I mean, the law isn't going to require you to do something it's not possible to do, at least not possible without creating strange, non-contiguous districts. It's just not going to be required. On the other hand, New York City has lost a little white population, lost a little Black population, and the Asian population has grown enormously. And I should probably leave this up to the lawyers, but I feel that you are going to be obliged to draw at least one, if not two, Asian districts to recognize this demographic shift in the increase in the Asian population.
So I think that the way I now got the clearance from your answer, so far the way we are, plotting or we're doing this, we are almost following all the rules and regulations that you mentioned. And of course, I agree with you, and we all did, that more than half of 629,000 are Asian population. If there would have been new district creation, there would have been at least 2 Asian districts. So, and I think that is why in our draft, we have one in Brooklyn, a district was almost 57% of Asian district was there, which was not there before. So the issue that was my concern, that I think we have heard some of the complaints that especially though where there is people has been electing their own people, own minority, ethnic-based people, but now with this accommodation of the increased population has shifted their district, either it had increased or it has decreased. So that is the concern I think we will be addressing the way you just answered, that wherever possible, we will do that. Wherever not possible, we must do the way you just gave the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other commissioners?
Dr. Hanley, I have a follow-up for you. So,
and Michael Schnall.
Yes, hi, Mike Schnall, representing Staten Island. Following Moff's questioning about the South Brooklyn district, there was a district at 38 which had it had a plurality of Latino voters, but slightly less percentage of Asian voters. They voted for a Latino elected official. When you look at District 1 in Manhattan, it has a plurality or even a majority of Asian voters, and yet they elected a Latino elected official in 2021. Prior to that, had elected an Asian elected official. How do you deal with a community that is inconsistent in the way in which they vote? Meaning, you talked about Black communities overwhelmingly voting for Black candidates. But if a community like the Asian community sometimes votes for Asian candidates, sometimes votes for white candidates, sometimes votes for Latinos or others, how does that square up with this analysis?
Well, first I have to correct you about District 38. What you're describing is not correct. District 38 was a plurality Hispanic district when it was drawn, but it is now in fact a plurality Asian district. And the candidate who was elected is supported by Hispanics, but not by Asians.
Oh, so okay, sorry, yeah. I apologize. Yeah, thank you for correcting that.
But when you're drawing a district, you want to make sure that the group that you're incorporating in the district is cohesive. So let's say you decide that you wanted to draw a Hispanic district, but you know that in this particular area, Hispanics are Puerto Rican and they support a different set of candidates than in this another area where, let's say, they're Latinos from Mexico and they support a different side. You would want to try and keep those two districts as separate districts if you could. I mean, it is true that that groups will vote differently. I mean, not all Black voters across the state will support all Black candidates.
And generally, I mean, I think the work of the commission reflects this, that the vast majority of the districts that we drew adhered to the, or close to the existing lines that were drawn back in 2012, 2013. Do you see other instances across the country in your experience where districts are drawn from whole cloth to create a majority of an ethnic group? Or is the majority of the work to tinker with the lines to increase the plurality or the majority?
There are examples of both across the country, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Let's say, for example, you had a plan in place that didn't recognize the number of Black voters in the state, and you redrew that plan and it still didn't recognize the Black voters in this. So it wouldn't have been a good idea to adhere to the old lines. But in another example, let's say the population shifted. I gave Alaska as an example. There, you know, maintaining, it didn't matter what you did, whether you redrew it or whether you stayed to the old lines as closely as possible, just tinkering around the edges to meet one person, one vote, you weren't going to get another Alaska Native district. So it, you know, that circumstances change, but you cannot use keeping the current districts as closely aligned with the previous districts as an excuse not to meet the Voting Rights Act. That you cannot do.
Right. However, to your point, if a district like 38 has a plurality or even a majority of Asian voters, it is not required of us to get them over 50%, right? We can, the requirement is not 50% plus one. The requirement is a demographic that allows them to vote for the candidate that they'd like to likely win, not guarantee that they have over 50% and guarantee that their candidate wins. Am I right on that?
You are right, but the Asian voters are not electing their candidate of choice in 38. That they're not. So that's not a good example.
But you said in New York, we don't have the type of data that they provided in Georgia. So we don't know, in fact, that Asian voters are not voting. We don't know if Asian voters are voting for Latino candidates, Black candidates, white candidates, or Asian candidates. We do know who wins, but we don't know the make of the voters who actually voted, correct?
The whole point of this was to tell you exactly what we do know. That's what I did. I did an estimation, and I can tell you that Asian voters did not support the representative in District 38. This analysis is done all the time. In Georgia, you have turnout by race, but in most jurisdictions, you don't. You have what you have here, and that's voting age population. And so what I've done here is an analysis of voting patterns. I can tell you how Asians are voting and who they're supporting. I can tell you who Black voters are supporting. I can tell you who Hispanic voters are supporting. That's the whole purpose of the analysis that I just did.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate your time and your expertise, and looking forward to your report.
Thank you for the questions. Other commissioners?
If I may, it's Lisa Soren. How are you?
Ms. Soren, Commissioner.
Please forgive me. I'm a little bit confused. So the analysis will be released when? I guess backtracking my question, how do we know that when we drew the lines based on so many conversations, maintaining the percentages as we saw based on the census, that we followed the law based on your analysis? does it mean we go back to the drawing board if your analysis doesn't match the work that we all did? Because we may not have followed the law based on the analysis. I guess I'm a bit confused as to if we were doing it based on the census demographics, communities of interest, and keeping within the percentages, which took many hours. If your analysis contradicts what we've done, do we then go back to the drawing board and start from scratch and re-educate our residents about what we may have done wrong? It's a loaded question, I know.
I see no need to go back to the drawing board and start all over again. I think that there's room for improvement, but I also think that you're not only going to get input from me, but you're going to get input from the community. And so you're going to most likely change some of the plan anyway, but I don't see a wholehearted, let's start all over from scratch kind of effort involved in this.
Okay, well, I guess the reason I say is because I have heard the rumblings of some electeds or residents who say we may not have followed the regulations as they're supposed to be, you know, whether it's frustration or personal frustration or legality, but they use the word legal, right? Or the transparency, and use the fact of the chaos that happened at the state. So I guess my personal concern, and I can imagine, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, my other commissioners, but I guess it would concern me that if we didn't know a piece that we may not have been following legally, right, based on the analysis, that it would concern me that we didn't have all the information prior to drawing the lines. And I may be wrong. This is really coming from an area of not totally understanding why we're listening to, and please forgive me, it's not meant for listening to something so drastically important after the first draft has been released. And I, you know, maybe there's not an answer, but I'm really trying to understand the process for the best interest of the residents. We're being asked to participate in these community meetings, and I just want to make sure that the information we have as commissioners and as residents really fall within the guidelines of everything we have committed to our residents, that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's.
May I ask a clarifying question? Because I thought in the review sessions, we were told by the map drawers that they were presenting the lines to Dr. Handley for her input, that we were in compliance. I'm not saying a definitive but that they did comply. At least that's what I heard being said by the guys drawing the lines. Did I mishear that?
You did not. I did a preliminary review of the boundaries. I did it for 3 plans, and it is my belief that you selected the best of the 3 plans, but I think that there's room for improvement, not just in terms of Voting Rights Act compliance, but you probably want to improve it in other ways as well.
Thank you for that clarifying question. And thank you so much, Dr. Hadley.
If I may just interject for a second, because I think the clarifying question and Commissioner Soren's question were outstanding questions. I think we had a solid foundation based on both the input from Dr. Handley as well as from our legal team as well. And I think, as we've stated a number of times, both internally as well as externally, as it being a preliminary draft plan, it allows us to adjust accordingly. But I think the foundation was there that put us in both the legal compliance, but also in the compliance of what the doctor just articulated in her presentation. But obviously, there's always room for improvement, and there will be room for improvement. And as a result, I think of the feedback from the public, which includes our elected officials, we will factor those decisions in because people really do have, and which is the whole point of the process, great feedback as far as, well, you didn't include this, or you need to include that. But I think based on what Dr. Hanley just said, that foundation had been applied to the variety of scenarios. And as a result of that, that was what the vote was based on. So that's my interpretation of the step-by-step process that we undertook and the next phase of what we'll be doing starting next week. Other commissioners?
Hi, this is Commissioner Collado. Thank you, Dr. Hanley, for your presentation. I just have a quick clarifying question for your analysis. I know that it's primarily it's a racial analysis, but are there any other factors that are considered when you determine that, like, for instance, the Asian community is not electing their candidate of choice in a certain district?
No, it's a statistical analysis that only looks at voting patterns based on race or ethnicity. So, for example, the quality of the candidates or the amount of money the candidates spent are not considered in the analysis.
Understood. What about, are there any other factors intrinsic to the voting population, maybe age or income, that may be considered, or no?
Not in this analysis, no. It literally is just the demographic composition of the precincts and the voting patterns.
Understood. Thank you.
A follow-up question to that. From one of the things you said, Dr. Hanley, the analysis is based upon those, 5 categories according to the Voting Rights Act of groups. Am I correct on that?
The Voting Rights Act recognizes certain protected groups, and those groups are Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, Alaska Native, and American Indian. Those are the groups that are protected.
Right. Let me use an example far away, and you mentioned it a little bit, but there isn't any ability, or there isn't any requirement, and then whether or not there's an ability to do the analysis for subgroups within those groups. So, for example, you mentioned Mexicans voting one way, etc. According to the Voting Rights Act and what the analysis, I'm going to use a completely non-professional term, it doesn't make any difference because there's not a sub protection under that. And let me give you an example far away from home. It doesn't matter whether you are Puerto Rican or Cuban in Florida, it's all considered Hispanic.
There was a court case in Florida in which this became an issue because the fact is that what the state of Florida wanted to do was draw an extra Hispanic district in Dade County for Hispanics who lived in Tampa. But in fact, they're not cohesive. Hispanics who lived in Tampa were Puerto Rican or old Mexican, and they were Democrats. And Hispanics who lived in Florida, in South Florida, were Republican, and they weren't cohesive, so it made no sense to draw the extra district down in Dade County for Hispanics up in Tampa, where you couldn't draw a district. They weren't geographically concentrated. So it is, you do sometimes take that into account into whether the group is cohesive or not. And there's a big difference between those groups, and it comes out that they just simply aren't politically cohesive. So you wouldn't be drawing a district in Dade County for Hispanics who voted very differently up in Tampa.
Monsignor, follow-up?
So let me be a little precise in that. But is that, but in terms of the protected categories, there's no distinction.
That's correct
That's
In terms
all I
of-
wanted to know.
Well, let me extend, that is true in terms of the Federal Voting Rights Act. I'm not sure what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act has
Okay.
to say about this issue.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, further questions?
Hi, this is Commissioner Johnson. Just a quick follow-up to that. Is it that, Dr. Hanley, is it that the lack of political cohesiveness that you talked about in those two different Hispanic communities in Florida, that would be reflected though in the racial block voting analysis, right?
That's correct, because
Yeah.
it was area specific. I mean, if I had
Yeah.
done it statewide, it wouldn't show, but it's area specific. This is how, for example, you could tell if say Mexican Hispanics were located in one district, they were geographically concentrated in one district, and you had say Cuban Hispanics in another, you could tell the voting patterns were different because they were geographically separate. But that's the only way that you could tell.
Thank you.
Other commissioners? So,
Dr. Hanley?
go ahead, Judge, please. Judge, go.
This is Marilyn Go. You had mentioned that there are 6 protected groups under the state law, and does your analysis cover the other 3 non-minority groups?
So you don't have enough Native Americans, and you don't have enough Alaska Natives, and you don't. So those 2 groups I didn't analyze here. You couldn't do an analysis, and you couldn't draw a district for those 2 groups, for American Indians or Alaska Natives.
And related to that is the question of defining the critical mass for having a community of interest. What would be the numbers that you would put to that? 10%?
Community of interest is a totally different concept, although of course many of these communities that we're looking at their voting patterns are communities of interest. But you can have a community of interest that's quite small and not large enough to be a district, but might want to be intact within a district. So there is a relationship between communities of interest and the work that I do, in that some of these, they're all communities of interest, but communities of interest is a much broader term that also would cover groups that aren't covered by the Voting Rights Act.
Judge,
and you don't have to have a certain number in order to create a district for them. In fact, you don't have to create a district for them. You might just keep them intact, as opposed to you wouldn't want to divide them.
Okay, and from your research, I mean, is it fair to say that community of interests tend to be just geographically clustered? I'm just trying to get a handle on what we need to be looking at in mapping.
So communities of interest aren't necessarily geographically concentrated, but if you're mapping, those are the only communities of interest that you can take into account because you're drawing maps. So if it's dispersed across the city in a way that you couldn't draw a district, there's nothing you can do about them in terms of creating a district.
And for us, and this is just from sheer ignorance of and technological awkwardness in dealing with the software, how do we locate these communities of interest on, I mean, where's the data for this, if there is any?
So that is not something that I can tell from the analysis that I do, other than saying, for example, Black voters here are definitely a politically cohesive community of interest. But if you want communities of interest beyond that, mostly this comes from the public hearings. Although there are demographers and geographers out there that might be putting together communities of interest maps that are looking at something beyond with a broader definition, a broader stroke than I'm looking at it. But often it just comes from the community itself, and the community will come into a hearing and say, we're a community of interest. Here's where we're located. This is why we're a community of interest. But I'm afraid that my analysis won't really help with that.
Can we take a second, especially since I know we have the public as a part of this discussion as well, for definitions itself? So when we talk about, say, for example, opportunity districts or communities of interest, can you just take us through a little bit of overview of how that's defined? And also, one of my questions, towards the end of your presentation, I heard you mention a distinction between Black and Hispanic voters, and I think it sounded like to me threshold levels. You're talking about 50% or more than 50%. So can you do a deeper dive into that type of question, and also just from your vantage point of what you studied, what's part of your purview, any type of definitions that people may need to have, including, say, for example, me and maybe other commissioners as well, in addition to the public?
Okay, I'll start with majority minority districts. So a majority minority district means typically that you have a district that's at least 50% Black in voting age population, or if you're dealing with Hispanics, the courts, for example, the 9th and the 5th Circuit has said, because the number of non-citizens is higher for this group, we're actually going to not look at voting age population, we're going to look at citizen voting age population. So typically when you say majority Black district, you're talking about a district that's at least 50% Black in voting age population, or 50% Hispanic and citizen voting age population. So that's one way. Now, it might be different than a minority opportunity district. A minority opportunity district might be more than that, or it might be less than that. And it will depend on the voting patterns of not just the minority group, but say the other groups within the district. So a minority, so a Black voting, a Black opportunity district, you have more than one here in New York City that is clearly not majority Black in voting age population, but is consistently electing the Black preferred candidate. So that would be a Black opportunity district. That is what the Voting Rights Act encourages you to draw. But you have to show that if you're going to challenge a plan, you have to show that you could draw a Black voting age population district. But the remedy might not be a 50% Black voting age population district. It might actually be a 45%. So they're not necessarily the same. You've got a majority district, you've got an opportunity district, and the other thing I'm going to talk about is a coalition district. And this is a district that, well, you have a coalition district, at least one that I can think of, and that is in Staten Island, where no minority group is predominant. It is only when you combine all three groups that you get a 50% plus district, but it consistently elects a candidate that is supported by all three minority groups. So it's a coalition district. I've never heard the term community of interest district used, but clearly you want to take communities of interest into account when you're drawing districts, and it may be the case that that community of interest predominates in that group. So I'm thinking, for example, when we were drawing districts in Michigan, there is a big Arab American population that's not protected by the Voting Rights Act, but was large enough to create a district, and that became a community of interest district drawn for a group that was not protected by the Voting Rights Act. I think I've covered the definitions, but
no, thank you. Further questions from the commissioners?
Mr. Chair, I just want to make a comment because I think I am feeling good about Dr. Hanley's presentation. It clearly indicates that commissioners, whatever the draft map we have submitted, we have followed US Constitution, Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, and later amended New York State law and New York City Charter very well. I think we got an A. Now we will be shooting for A+. Thank you very much.
Wow. You're a tough grader, but I appreciate the, I think there'll be others who say that we didn't achieve the A level yet. But I think in all seriousness, the goal is to have this as a part of the process to make sure that we are more educated as far as, I think, the details of what Dr. Hanley provided us in her presentation, but also to share with the community as suggested by commissioners, that we have that opportunity to do that. And with that being said, we still have a lot of work to do. And I will take us as a group back to, I think, the opening of the doctor when she, and I'm paraphrasing, basically said she doesn't envy our task moving forward. In that there are a lot of variables that we have to deal with. And as I've said publicly, we're dealing with the city of Memphis being relocated into New York City within the same 51 council districts. And I think that's what the challenge is as we take the next step, which will take place starting next week with the hearings that'll be first in Queens, and also listening to both the public and the commissioners in moving the meetings to later in the afternoon, evening hours, as well as one on Sunday. So, we encourage people to spread the word, but I don't want to monopolize, but again, to the commissioners or to staff, are there any other questions for the doctor?
Hi, Commissioner Johnson. Commissioner Johnson here.
Yes.
Dr. Hanley, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time, was it 2013, 2012, 2013, you did this for New York City. You the commission was working with a 10% deviation, and so now we're working with 5%. How does that impact your particular analysis, if at all? I'm just curious.
That's a very good question. It does not impact the way that I do my analysis, but what would be a curious question would be, what if you could draw a minority district if you were allowed a 10% violation, 10% deviation, but state law required you to have only a 5% deviation? And I'm going to leave it up to the lawyers to answer that question. But that's the only way I could see it impacting what I do, is does it make it harder to draw minority districts?
Thank you.
Mike Schnall here again. Just a quick follow-up, Dr. Hanley. When you provide your analysis to the commission, do you do it as an analysis of the drafted lines that we presented in juxtaposition to the existing lines from the previous district? Or are you just looking at what we redrew in totality?
That's a little complicated, and the reason why it's complicated is the racial block voting analysis I've done is off of previous elections, so that's off of the districts that are in place now. And then when I look at proposals, I'm looking to take those voting patterns and apply them to a new situation, and so in a way, I'm doing both.
Great, thank you.
Please.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying, please, go ahead.
Marilyn, go again. I'm just curious, you did make the comment you thought the set of maps that the commission voted to move forward was the best, but two questions related to that. One is, because of the way it's drawn, and the state 5% deviation, it does affect the size of the council districts outside of Staten Island, and would that affect your analysis? And secondly, would you be prepared? I mean, we're going to be having another session with you to talk about any suggestions you have for improvements to the maps, because as you know, there has been a lot of feedback from certain sectors about the map, so there has to be consideration of their views too. And anyway, I'll let you answer first before I follow up.
So at this point, my review of the preliminary plan was based on what I knew about the current plan and preliminary plan and 2 other alternatives. One thing that I'm here in New York today to do is to explore other possibilities, because at this point I've only reacted to maps that have been drawn, and I'm curious about what's possible that hasn't been presented in a map. So I am going to look at that today. I think I'm afraid I don't remember. I don't know if I've answered your entire question or not.
You know, by focusing, by having 3 districts wholly contained in Staten Island, that and having the 5% deviation under state law, would your analysis of the of the voting rights block, would your voting rights block analysis and the appropriateness of districts drawn change if the if the other boroughs weren't subject to the very minimum variation that they would that they're currently subject to under the present maps presented?
I think that's an excellent question. What I could tell you at this point is that keeping Staten Island intact certainly did not hurt the coalition district that's within Staten Island. What I don't know is if you crossed to one of the boroughs and therefore were able to increase the amount of deviation in the other 5 boroughs, the other 4 boroughs, if that would help you draw minority districts or not. I don't know the answer to that, but that is something that needs to be explored, because if in fact it meant that these very rigid deviations in the other 4 boroughs meant you couldn't draw a minority district, then that would be a problem. And I don't know the answer to that. It may not be a problem. It may be, you know, keeping Staten Island intact might be a problem for a different reason, but it might not be for the Voting Rights Act. And I don't know the answer to that. I do know that it isn't a problem for the coalition district on Staten Island, but I don't know what the implications are for the possibilities of, say, an Asian district in Queens or keeping a Hispanic district in Brooklyn. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess my concern is because all of the other districts are larger than the districts in Staten Island, and they're in particular the black districts in Brooklyn. We're talking about percentages that are just barely over 50%. You know, I'm just curious, and we can, you know, this you may not be prepared to answer this, but I just want to make sure that having the proper deviations will protect the minority communities in the other boroughs. Because there's no question that Staten Island District 49 has a coalition voting block, but that coalition will still hold if the Staten Island, if that district were larger and there was a crossover. I think, just based on my look at the where the population is located in Staten Island. Anyway, it's half question and half preaching and hoping that we'll get more answers from you.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I think it is something that needs to be explored.
Thank you, Judge. As we wrap up, any final questions to Dr. Hanley? John, would you like to give any type of closing remarks before we close out this session?
I would just say that this is going to be an ongoing dialogue with our experts on the quantitative side, social science side, and as well our legal experts that are working with us, along with the commissioners, and our input from New Yorkers to help solve these puzzles and bring us a new set of council districts for new New Yorkers.
Thank you, John. Commissioners, let me thank you. And since this is a formal meeting, if there aren't any further questions, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Motion.
Lisa Corin, second.
Motion second, Darren Porcher.
Thank you, Dr. Portia. All those in favor to adjourn?
Aye.
Any opposition? Thank you for an excellent session. Doctor, thank you also for an excellent presentation, and we look forward